Farewell to Manzanar, continuing in Chapter 5 on page 34, middle of the page. You might say it would have happened sooner or later anyway. This sliding apart of such a large family in post-war California. People get married, their interests shift. But there is no escaping the fact that our internment accelerated the process, made it happen so suddenly it was almost tangible. Not only did we stop eating at home, there was no longer a home to eat in. The cubicles we had were too small for anything you might call, quote, living. Mama couldn't cook meals there. It was impossible to find any privacy there. We slept there and spent most of our waking hours elsewhere. Page 35. Mama had gone to work again soon after we arrived. The call went out for people with any kind of skill to offer their services. Thousands were responding, with great surges of community spirit, sometimes with outright patriotism, wanting to, quote, do their part. Woody signed on as a carpenter. One of my brothers-in-law was a roofing foreman. Another ran a reservoir crew. Mama had worked as a dietitian in Washington after she was married. In camp, this was high-priority training. In addition to the daily multitude, those amateur cooks were faced with allergy cases, diabetics, nursing mothers, infants who required special feedings. For Mama, it was also a way to make a little money. $19 a month. This was top wage for an internee. Unskilled labor started at 8. All volunteers, of course. You didn't have to get out of bed in the morning if you didn't want to. Mama wanted the work. She had a monthly fee to pay the warehouse in Los Angeles where she had stored what remained of our furniture and silver just before we evacuated. She worried about this constantly. She worried about Papa, too. Letters from him trickled in, once or twice a month, with half the words blacked out, calling her sweetheart for the first time in 15 years. She was always distracted, staring at things I could never see. I would try to get her attention, grab her around the legs. At night in bed she would hug me close, but during the day she never seemed to notice me. Page 36. Adrift, I began to look elsewhere for attention and thus took the first steps out of my child's realm toward a world of grown-ups other than my parents. Though I was only 7, my images of certain people from this period are very precise, because I began to see adults for the first time. On Terminal Island, I first saw Asians, those demon children who had terrorized me. At Manzanar, past the fear of slanted eyes and high cheekbones, I watched with fresh amazement the variety of faces and bodies and costumes all around me. This may have resulted in part from the life Manzanar had forced upon us all. Once the weather warmed up, it was an out-of-doors life where you only went, quote, home at night when you finally had to. 10,000 people on an endless promenade inside the square mile of barbed wire that was the wall around our city. One of the neighbors was a tall, broad woman, taller than anyone in the camp, as far as I can recall. She walked erectly and wore an Aunt Jemima scarf around her head. She was married to a Japanese man, and they had adopted a little Japanese girl I sometimes played with. But this woman, I realized much later, was half black, with light mulatto skin, passing as a Japanese in order to remain with her husband. She wore scarves everywhere to cover her giveaway hair. In the barracks facing ours there lived an elegant woman, who astounded me each time I saw her. She and her husband both came from Japan, and her long, aristocratic face was always a ghastly white. In traditional fashion, she powdered it with rice flour every morning. Top of page 37, right here. By old country standards, this made her more beautiful. For a long time, I thought she was diseased. 2 more white faces stand out in my memory. A pair of nurses I saw from time to time in the clinic. They wore white shoes, white hose, and white dresses. Above their bleached faces, their foreheads had been shaved halfway over their scalp's curve to make a sharp widow's peak. where starched black hair began to arch upward, reminding me of a cobra's hood. Their lips were gone, their eyebrows were plucked. They were always together, a pair of reptilian kabaki creatures at loose in the camp hospital. You might say they were the negatives for two other women I soon began to see almost every day, and in fact saw more of for a while than I did my mother. Their robes were black, their heads were hooded in white. Sister Mary Suzanne was about 40 then, a frail gentlewoman from Japan who could speak no English. Sister Mary Bernadette was a feisty, robust little Canadian Japanese woman who spoke both languages fluently. They were Maryknoll nuns, members of that missionary order, whose special task it is to go into a country with knowledge of its language and convert its people to the Catholic faith. Before the war, they had run an orphanage in Los Angeles for children of Japanese ancestry. Evacuated to Manzanar and given the job of caring for some 50 orphans interned there, they set up what came to be known as Children's Village. Top of page 38. And they had one barracks turned into a chapel. They were joined by Father Steinbach, one of the few Caucasians to live among us inside the compound and eat in our mess halls. He was greatly admired for this, and many internees converted to Catholicism before the camp was closed. I was almost one of them. Papa stepped in just before my baptism day. If he had been there during those early months, I probably would have never started spending time with the Maryknolls. He was always suspicious of organized religions. I think he had already tried to scare me away from Catholics. That was one of his prime methods of instruction: fear. On my way home from school each day in Ocean Park, I would break into a run as I passed the local Catholic church. The nuns I glimpsed were robed in ghostly figures I wanted no part of. Culturally, we were like those Jews who observe certain traditions but never visit a synagogue. We kept a little Buddhist shrine in the house, and we celebrated a few Japanese holidays that were religiously connected, the way Christmas is. But we never said prayers. I had never been inside a Buddhist church. And as for Christianity, I had not heard the word God until we reached Terminal Island. I first heard about Jesus when the one friend I made there, another Japanese girl, took me to a Baptist Sunday school on the island, where a Caucasian teacher bewildered me with pictures of lambs and donkeys and golden domed pavilions. Page 39. For some reason, those did not appeal to me nearly as much as the stories of the saints and martyrs I heard a few months later when I began to study catechism with the Maryknolls. Soon, I was over there every afternoon and most of Sunday. With no regular school to attend and no home to spend time in, it's no mystery that I should have been drawn to these two kind and generous women. They had organized a recreation program. They passed out candy. But what kept me coming back once I started were the tales of the unfortunate women like Saint Agatha, whose breasts were cut off when she refused to renounce her faith. Oh my. I had to walk nearly a mile to reach the chapel, and walk a mile back. That summer it was miserably hot. Over 100 degrees most days. Here we are. Yet I made the trip gladly. A big, homely girl, about 20 years old, who wore boys' shoes and an Eisenhower jacket, taught catechism to the younger kids. She loved to sit us down and fix us with the eyes of a mother superior and tell us about Saint Agatha or Saint Juliana, who was boiled alive, or Saint Marcella, who was whipped to death by the Goths. I was fascinated with the miseries of women who had suffered and borne such afflictions. On my way home, I would hike past row upon row of black barracks, watching mountains waver through that desert heat, with the sun trying to dry up my very blood, and imagine in some childish way that I was among them, that I too was up there on the screen of, top of page 40, on the screen of history, in a white-laced catechism dress, sweating and grimy, yet selflessly carrying my load. Here we are on page 40. I fulfilled this little fantasy one blistering afternoon when the heat finally got me. Sunstroke. While crossing one of the wide sandy fire breaks that separated some of the blocks, I passed out. This put me in bed for a week. After I recovered, several months went by before I resumed my catechism. For one thing, Papa discouraged me. It was just before this happened that he had returned from Fort Lincoln. He was back among us, making decisions, giving commands. For a while it seemed we would almost be a family again. But it didn't turn out that way. He was not the same man. Something terrible had happened to him in North Dakota. He arrived at Manzanar on a Greyhound bus. We all went down to the main gate to meet him, everyone but Woody's wife, Chizu, who was in the camp hospital. The previous day, she'd given birth to Papa's first grandson. She named him George, in honor of Papa's return. 2 of my sisters were pregnant at the time, and they were there at the gate in hot weather smocks, along with Woody, who had left the hospital long enough to welcome Papa back, and Granny and Mama and the rest of the family, a dozen of us standing in the glare, excited, yet very reverent as the bus pulled in. The door whished open, and the first thing we saw was a cane. I will never forget it. Poking from the shaded interior sunlight, a straight, polished maple limb spotted with dark-lidded eyes where small knotholes had been stained and polished. Page 41 right here. Then Papa stepped out, wearing a fedora hat and a wilted white shirt. This was September 1942. He had been gone 9 months. He had aged 10 years. He looked over 60, gaunt, wilted as his shirt, underweight, leaning on that cane and favoring his right leg. He stood there surveying his clan, and nobody moved, not even Mama, waiting to see what he would do or say, waiting for some cue from him as to how we should deal with this. I was the only one who approached him. I had not thought of him much at all after he was taken away. He was simply gone. Now I was so happy to see him that I ran up and threw my arms around his waist and buried my face in his belt. I thought I should be laughing and welcoming him home, but I started to cry. By this time everyone was crying. No one else had moved yet to touch him. It was as if the youngest, the least experienced, had been appointed to display what the others, held back by awe or fear or some old country notion of respect for the patriarch, could not. I hugged him tighter, wanting to be so happy that my father had come back. Yet I hurt so inside I could only welcome him with convulsive tears.